I remember the exact moment it all fell apart. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, no grand declarations that left echoes in the room. It was just a simple sentence, tossed into the air without a second thought, one I didn't even realize was loaded until it had already detonated. We were having dinner with Kara, my childhood best friend. Ethan was at the head of the table, as always, quietly eating while Kara and I carried the conversation, our voices filling the room the way they always did when we got together. The wine was flowing and laughter came easy. We were talking about relationships, old flames, funny stories, the kind of harmless reminiscing that feels like peeling back layers of your younger self just for fun. Kara leaned back in her chair, swirling the last bit of wine in her glass. "Remember when we made those lists of our dream guys in college?" she said, laughing. "Tall, dark, and emotionally available, was that your type?" I laughed too, the sound bubbling up without hesitation. "God, yes, and no offense, Ethan," I said, turning toward him with a grin, "but I would have never dated someone like you back then." It was meant as a joke, a light-hearted acknowledgement of how much I'd changed since those days. Ethan, my steady, thoughtful, deeply practical husband, was nothing like the wild, unpredictable boys I used to chase when I was younger. That was part of why I loved him. But the moment the words left my mouth, I felt the air shift. Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, deliberately, and his eyes flickered to mine for the briefest second before he looked away. Kara gave a nervous laugh, trying to brush past the awkwardness, but I couldn't shake the weight that had settled over the table. Later, after Kara had left and I was stacking plates in the sink, I noticed how quiet the house had become. Ethan wasn't one for idle chatter, but tonight his silence felt different, thicker, heavier. "Hey," I called over my shoulder. "You okay?" He was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at nothing in particular. "Yeah," he said, but his voice was flat, devoid of its usual warmth. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked over to him. "Look, if that thing I said at dinner bothered you, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just joking." He nodded, but it was a hollow gesture. "It's fine," he said, but I knew it was. "Ethan, come on," I pressed. "You're not actually upset, are you? I was just being honest. I mean, you're not exactly the type of guy I would have gone for back then." "That doesn't mean anything now." He turned to me then, his expression unreadable. "It does." There was something in his tone that made my chest tight. "No," I said more forcefully than I intended. "We've been married for 5 years, you know I love you." He looked at me for a long moment as if searching for something he wasn't sure he'd find. Then he sighed and shook his head. "I'm going for a walk." Before I could respond, he was already at the door, pulling on his coat. "Ethan, it's late," I called after him, but he didn't stop. The door closed behind him with a resolute finality that left me standing there stunned. I waited for a minute, thinking he'd come back in, but the minutes stretched on and the knot in my stomach tightened. I debated texting him, but something stubborn held me back. If he wanted to be dramatic, that was on him. Still, as the hours crept by and the house grew colder, doubt began to gnaw at the edges of my resolve. What if he didn't come back? What if this wasn't just about a stupid comment but something deeper, something I hadn't seen coming? I poured myself another glass of wine and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. The cursor blinked at me mockingly as I typed out a message. "I'm sorry if what I said upset you. Can we talk when you get back?" I hovered over the send button, but then anger flared up in me. Why was I apologizing? I hadn't done anything wrong. He was the one being ridiculous, walking out like that instead of just talking to me. I deleted the message and set my phone down with a thud. But the longer I sat there, the more my bravado crumbled. The truth was, I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't even fully understand what this was. All I knew was that the man I loved had walked out on me tonight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was my fault. I didn't sleep that night. The bed felt too big without Ethan in it, the sheets cold and untouched on his side. I tossed and turned, the events of the evening looping endlessly in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, calm, distant, unreadable. That was the part that gnawed at me the most. Ethan didn't yell, he didn't argue, he just left. And somehow that hurt worse than any shouting match ever could have. By dawn, I gave up on sleep altogether. I shuffled into the kitchen, my eyes gritty with exhaustion. The wine bottle from the night before sat on the counter, accusing me with its empty presence. I shoved it into the recycling bin with more force than necessary, the clatter echoing through the quiet house. I made coffee, the familiar ritual grounding me for a moment. The aroma filled the air, warm and bitter, but it did little to soothe my nerves. I sipped the scalding liquid, hoping it would burn away the knot in my chest. My phone sat on the table, dark and silent. No missed calls, no messages. I stared at it, willing it to light up with a text from Ethan. "Sorry I walked out. I just needed space. Let's talk," but it remained stubbornly still. I considered calling him, but pride held me back. If he wanted to talk, he knew where to find me. I wasn't going to chase after him like some desperate fool. Instead, I did what I always did when I felt out of control. I cleaned. I started with the kitchen, scrubbing the counters until they gleamed. Then I moved on to the living room, dusting every surface, rearranging the pillows on the couch, and vacuuming the rug even though it didn't need it. The physical activity gave me a sense of purpose, a way to channel my restless energy. But as I picked up Ethan's mug from the coffee table, my resolve wavered. The sight of it half empty, the faint ring of coffee staining the ceramic, brought a lump to my throat. How many mornings had we spent here together, sipping coffee in comfortable silence? How many times had I taken those moments for granted? I set the mug down carefully, my hands trembling. The truth was creeping in, insidious and undeniable. I'd hurt him. I didn't know how deeply, but I knew it was more than I wanted to admit. The sound of my phone vibrating broke through my thoughts. My heart leapt as I snatched it up, hoping it was Ethan. But it was Kara. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey," she said softly. "How are you doing?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Fantastic. My husband walked out on me last night, but other than that, things are great." There was a pause on the other end. "Maya, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize things were that bad." "They're not, weren't," I corrected myself. "It was just a stupid comment. I didn't think it was a big deal, but I guess it was to him." "What did you say?" I sighed, rubbing my temples. "I said I'd never date someone like him back in the day. It was a joke, you know. I didn't mean anything by it." Kara was quiet for a moment. "I mean, I can see why he might have taken that personally." My stomach twisted. "You're supposed to be on my side." "I am," she said gently. "But I'm also saying maybe he felt like you were dismissing who he is, like he's some consolation prize or something." "That's not what I meant," I insisted, though doubt gnawed at the edges of my conviction. "I know," Kara said, "but does he?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice small. I don't know how to fix this." "Maybe just start by listening to him," she suggested. "When he's ready to talk." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah, maybe." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. Kara's words echoed in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. Was that how Ethan saw it? That I thought he wasn't good enough, that I regretted choosing him. The thought made my chest ache. I wanted to believe that wasn't true, but honesty had a way of sneaking up on you when you least expected it. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was a part of me, a small, stubborn part, that had always wondered what if. What if I'd ended up with someone more like the boys I used to chase? What if I hadn't settled down so quickly? What if I'd chosen a different path? The guilt was suffocating. I stood up abruptly, needing to move, to do something, anything to escape the weight of my thoughts. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, the cold morning air biting at my skin as I stepped outside. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by memories and regret. All I knew was that I needed to find a way back to Ethan, back to us, before it was too late. The streets were quiet, the early morning chill biting through my coat as I walked aimlessly through the neighborhood. My breath clouded the air in front of me, but I barely noticed. My thoughts were louder than the sound of my boots against the pavement, louder than the wind rustling through the trees. I replayed the night over and over in my head, dissecting every second, every word, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when things had truly shifted. Was it the way I laughed, the casual tone I'd used? Or was it something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time, waiting for the right moment to explode? I thought back to when Ethan and I first met. He wasn't the kind of guy who made a grand entrance or swept you off your feet with charm and bravado. He was steady, dependable, the kind of man who earned your trust over time rather than demanding it up front. At first, I hadn't even noticed him. He was just there, always kind, always thoughtful, always quietly observing the chaos around him without judgment. It wasn't until he showed up at my door after a particularly bad day, holding a cup of my favorite coffee and a paperback book he thought I'd like, that I realized how much I needed someone like him in my life. But maybe that was the problem. I had needed him. And now I wasn't sure if I knew how to love him without that need as the foundation. The thought unsettled me, and I quickened my pace, trying to outrun it. The park came into view, its empty benches and frost-covered grass bathed in the soft light of the rising sun. I found myself gravitating toward a bench near the pond, the one where Ethan and I used to sit during lazy Sunday afternoons. I sat down, the cold seeping through my coat, and stared out at the water. The stillness was unnerving. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and for a fleeting moment, hope flared in my chest. I pulled it out, my heart racing, but it was Ethan. It was my mother. I hesitated before answering. "Hi, Mom," I said, forcing a semblance of cheerfulness into my voice. "Sweetheart," she said warmly. "I was just thinking about you. Everything okay?" I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. "Yeah, I'm fine, just out for a walk." "You sound tired, late night." "You could say that," I muttered. There was a pause, the kind only a mother could fill with unspoken understanding. "Is it Ethan?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I blinked back, tears, my voice cracking. "He walked out last night." "Oh, honey," she said softly. "What happened?" I took a shaky breath, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I said something stupid. We were with Kara and I made this dumb joke about how I never would have dated someone like him back in the day, and I didn't mean it like that, but he left." Mom didn't respond right away, letting my words hang in the air. Do you think it's just about what you said? Her question sliced through me. I wanted to say yes, that it was just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But deep down I knew better. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe it's more than that. Marriage is complicated, she said gently. It's easy to hurt the people we love without meaning to, but it sounds like you both need to talk about what's really going on. I stared at the pond, the water rippling gently in the breeze. What if he doesn't want to talk? Then you show him that you're willing to listen, she said. Sometimes that's all it takes. Her words settled over me like a blanket, offering warmth but no easy answers. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, letting the cold seep into my bones. Listening. It was something Ethan had always done for me, quietly and without expectation. He never demanded explanations or grand gestures. He just listened, and I had taken that for granted. The realization hit me like a wave, washing over every defensive wall I'd built around myself since the night before. I'd been so focused on my own feelings, my own need to be understood, that I hadn't stopped to consider his. I stood up, my breath hitching in the cold air. It wasn't going to be easy. I didn't know if I could fix this or if Ethan would even let me try. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep running from the truth, no matter how much it scared me. I needed to go home, and I needed to be ready to listen. The house was silent when I returned, the kind of heavy silence that pressed down on you, amplifying every creak of the floorboards and rustle of fabric. I stood in the entryway, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the space, hoping irrationally that Ethan would be there waiting for me. But it was empty. I peeled off my coat, hanging it on the hook by the door, and hesitated. My shoes left faint wet marks on the hardwood, a trail of evidence that I'd been somewhere, though I wasn't sure it mattered. The weight of the night, the morning, and everything in between clung to me like a second skin. I moved to the living room, sinking onto the couch with a sigh. My body felt heavy, drained from the restless night and my aimless wandering through the streets. The faint scent of Ethan's cologne lingered in the fabric, and I closed my eyes, breathing it in. The ache in my chest grew sharper. I replayed Mom's words in my head, you show him that you're willing to listen. It sounded simple in theory, but in practice, I didn't know where to begin. How do you bridge a gap you didn't even realize was widening until it was too late? I thought back to that moment at dinner, the easy laughter, the casual remark I'd thrown out without a second thought. I would have never dated someone like you back then. Why had I said it? The truth was, I wasn't even sure. It had felt harmless at the time, a joke born from nostalgia and a little too much wine. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was a sliver of truth buried in those words. I hadn't been looking for someone like Ethan back then. I'd been reckless, chasing highs and heartbreaks with equal fervor. Ethan was different. He was steady, dependable, and sometimes, though I hated admitting it, predictable. And that predictability had become both a comfort and a source of quiet frustration over the years. But I loved him, I knew that, didn't I? The front door creaked open, startling me from my thoughts. My heart raced as I stood up, nerves tightening every muscle in my body. Ethan stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing in the stillness. His coat was damp from the morning chill, and his hair was tousled like he'd been running his hands through it. We stood there in awkward silence, neither of us knowing what to say. Hey, I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Hey, he replied, his tone neutral. I swallowed hard. You didn't come home last night. He nodded, his gaze flickering to the floor. I stayed at a hotel. The words stung, but I pushed the hurt aside. Ethan, he held up a hand, stopping me. Before you say anything, I need to ask you something. I nodded, my throat tight. Do you regret being with me? He asked quietly, his voice steady but strained. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. No, I said quickly, stepping toward him. God, no, Ethan, I love you. Then why did you say that? His eyes met mine, raw and searching. Why would you tell your friend you'd never date someone like me? I wasn't thinking, I admitted, my voice trembling. It was just a dumb joke. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. He nodded slowly, but his expression remained guarded. But there's some truth to it, isn't there? I opened my mouth to protest, but the words caught in my throat. Honesty clawed its way to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. There was a time when I didn't know how to appreciate someone like you, I said carefully. Back then I was looking for, I don't even know, chaos maybe, but Ethan, that's not who I am anymore. And you're everything I didn't know I needed. He crossed his arms, his jaw tight. That's not exactly reassuring. I know, I admitted, but it's the truth. I'm not perfect and I say stupid things sometimes, but I'm grateful for you, for us, and I'm terrified I've messed it all up. His shoulders sagged slightly, the tension easing just a fraction. What didn't you just say that last night? Because I was too proud, I confessed. And scared. I hate being wrong and I hate feeling vulnerable. Ethan let out a heavy breath, running a hand through his hair. Maya, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need to know that you see me, that you choose me because you want to, not because it's convenient. Tears stung my eyes and I nodded fiercely. I do, I swear I do. He looked at me for a long moment as if weighing my words. Finally he sighed. Okay, I echoed, my voice shaky. He stepped closer, his expression softening. I'm not saying everything's fine overnight, but we'll figure it out. Relief washed over me and I reached for his hand. He let me take it, his grip warm and reassuring. Thank you, I whispered. Ethan squeezed my hand gently. We both have things to work on, but we'll get there. In that moment, I realized that love wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about being willing to face them together, even when it was messy and uncomfortable. And as we stood there, hands clasped tightly, I knew we were ready to try. The house was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel heavy or oppressive. The air felt lighter, as though the words we'd spoken had carved out space for something new, fragile but real. Ethan had gone upstairs to shower, and I lingered in the living room, staring at the spot where we'd stood just minutes before. I traced my thumb across the smooth curve of my wedding ring, the weight of it suddenly noticeable. How many times had I taken this simple band for granted? A symbol I wore without always remembering what it stood for. Love, yes, but also choice. The choice to stay, to fight, to grow even when it hurt. I thought back to what Ethan had said, I just need to know that you see me. That you choose me because you want to, not because it's convenient. Had I shown him that enough? Had I made it clear that I wanted him, not out of obligation, but because he was the person I couldn't imagine my life without? The truth was unsettling, and I didn't have an easy answer. Footsteps creaked on the stairs and Ethan appeared, his hair damp, a fresh t-shirt clinging to his chest. He paused when he saw me still standing there, his brow furrowing slightly. You okay? He asked. I nodded, though my thoughts were tangled. Yeah, just thinking. He walked over to me, stopping a few feet away. About us, I admitted, and how I've probably taken you for granted more than I realized. His expression softened, but there was still caution in his eyes. It goes both ways, you know. Maybe, I said, but I think I've been selfish. I've always expected you to just be there, no questions asked, and I didn't stop to think about how that might make you feel. Ethan crossed his arms, his gaze steady. Maya, I'm not keeping score. Relationships aren't about that. I know, I said quietly, but I want to do better. I want to make sure you know how much you mean to me. He looked at me for a long moment, as though weighing my sincerity. That means a lot. But actions speak louder than words, right? I smiled faintly, despite the heaviness in my chest. Yeah, you're right. We stood there, the silence between us less daunting now. You want breakfast? I asked, trying to break the tension. He raised an eyebrow. You cooking? I laughed softly. Hey, I'm not that bad. He grinned, the first real smile I'd seen from him in what felt like forever. Debatable. We moved to the kitchen together, the ease between us tentative but promising. I pulled out eggs and bread while Ethan leaned against the counter, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You remember the first time we cooked together? He asked suddenly. I glanced at him, smiling at the memory. Yeah, you insisted on making that fancy pasta dish, and we ended up burning half of it because we were too busy arguing over the recipe. He chuckled. Good times. I cracked an egg into the pan, the sizzle filling the room. We've come a long way since then. Yeah, he agreed, we have. The weight of the past day lingered between us, but it felt less oppressive now, like we were both willing to carry it together. As the eggs cooked, I glanced over at Ethan. I meant what I said earlier, I love you, and I know I need to show that more. He nodded, his gaze warm but still guarded. I love you too, Maya, always have. The simple honesty of his words hit me harder than any grand declaration ever could. I plated the eggs and handed him a plate. Truce over breakfast? I offered. He smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing further. Truce. We sat at the table together, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were on the same path again. And that was enough for now. The rest of the day passed quietly, filled with small, unspoken gestures that carried more weight than any apology ever could. Ethan stayed home, a subtle sign that he was choosing to be present, even if things still felt fragile. I noticed the way his hand lingered on the back of my chair during lunch, how he refilled my water glass without a word, and the way his gaze softened when I caught him looking at me. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Later that afternoon, I stood by the window, watching the sky shift from pale blue to muted gray. A storm was rolling in, the air thick with the promise of rain. The first few drops splattered against the glass, and I found myself tracing their paths with my finger, lost in thought. Behind me, I heard Ethan's footsteps as he walked into the room. He stopped beside me, his presence steady and grounding. Looks like it's going to pour, he said softly. Yeah. I glanced at him, my heart tugging at the sight of his familiar profile. Do you remember that time we got caught in the rain on our way back from the market? He smiled faintly. You made us take the long way home because you wanted to see that old bookstore. And then it started pouring, I added, laughing softly at the memory. We were drenched by the time we got back. You were shivering and I had to wrap you in like 3 blankets. But it was worth it, I said. That bookstore had the best poetry collection I'd ever seen. Ethan chuckled. Of course you'd think that was worth getting soaked for. Memory warmed the space between us, bridging the gap that had felt insurmountable just hours before. I miss that version of us sometimes, I admitted, my voice quiet. The way we used to get caught up in the simplest things. He nodded thoughtfully. Life got complicated. Yeah. A beat of silence stretched between us, filled only by the steady patter of rain against the window. But I think we can find our way back to that, I said, my voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling in my chest. If we try, Ethan's gaze met mine and there was a flicker of something in his eyes, hope maybe, or at least the willingness to believe in the possibility. I'd like that, he said quietly. The simplicity of his response was enough to loosen the knot in my chest. The rain picked up, sheets of water blurring the world outside. Without thinking, I grabbed his hand. Come on, he looked at me puzzled. Where? Outside. Maya, it's pouring. Exactly. I grinned, pulling him toward the door. When's the last time we danced in the rain? He shook his head, but there was a hint of amusement in his expression. You're impossible, and you love it. He didn't argue. We stepped onto the porch, the cold rain immediately soaking through our clothes. I let out a laugh, tilting my head back as the water drenched my face. Ethan stood beside me, shaking his head but smiling despite himself. You're ridiculous, he said, his voice carrying over the sound of the storm. Maybe, I admitted, but I'm happy right now. Are you? He paused as though weighing the question. Then to my surprise, he stepped off the porch and into the downpour, his laughter mingling with mine. I followed him, the mud squelching beneath my feet as we moved into the yard. The world around us faded away, leaving only the rain and the warmth of his hand in mine. We spun in lazy circles, our clothes clinging to our skin, hair plastered to our faces. It was messy and chaotic and beautiful in a way that made my heart ache with joy. As the rain poured down, washing away the weight of the past day, I realized that this was what love looked like, not perfection but presence. And in that moment, drenched and laughing under the stormy sky, I knew we were going to be okay. The storm had passed by the time we finally made our way back inside, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. Ethan's laughter lingered in my ears, the sound as rare as sunshine after weeks of gray skies. My heart felt lighter, as though we'd left something heavy out there in the rain. You're cleaning this up, Ethan teased, gesturing to the puddles we tracked through the living room. Worth it, I said, grinning. He shook his head, but there was warmth in his eyes. I'll get the towels. As he disappeared down the hall, I stood there, shivering but content. My hair clung to my face and my clothes were plastered to my skin, but I didn't care. It had been a long time since I'd felt this free. Ethan returned with a couple of towels, tossing one to me before wrapping the other around his shoulders. You're a terrible influence, he said, though there was no bite to his words. And you love it, I shot back, grinning as I rubbed the towel over my hair. Debatable, he said, but his smile gave him away. We dried off as best we could, the air between us warm despite the chill clinging to our damp clothes. The tension that had hung over us for so long felt distant now, like a storm that had finally broken. I'll make some tea, I offered, heading toward the kitchen. Ethan followed, leaning against the counter as I filled the kettle. You know, he said thoughtfully, I think that's the first time we've done something spontaneous in, I don't know how long. Too long, I agreed. He nodded, his expression turning serious. We got caught up, didn't we, in routines and responsibilities, forgot how to just be with each other. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. Yeah, I guess I thought as long as we were getting through the days that was enough, but it wasn't, was it? No, he said quietly. It was. The kettle whistled, breaking the heavy silence. I poured the hot water over the tea leaves, watching as the liquid darkened. The simple ritual grounded me, giving me a moment to gather my thoughts. I want to do better, I said finally, my voice steady despite the nerves tightening my chest. I want us to be more than just surviving. Ethan's gaze softened. Me too. We sat at the kitchen table, the warmth of the tea seeping into my hands as I cradled the mug. The rain had left the world outside fresh and clean, and I felt a flicker of hope that we could do the same for us. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, I admitted. About needing to feel seen. I don't think I realized how much I was taking you for granted, but I hear you, Ethan, and I want you to know that I see you, I choose you. He looked at me for a long moment, something unspoken passing between us. That means a lot, he said quietly. And I want to be better too. I know I can get stuck in my head sometimes, thinking everything's fine as long as we're not fighting. But I need to be more present. I reached across the table, my hand finding his. We'll figure it out together. His fingers curled around mine, the warmth of his touch grounding me. Yeah, together. We sat there, the rain-soaked memories lingering in the air between us. There were no grand promises or dramatic declarations, just a quiet understanding that we were both willing to try. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, cutting across the bed in golden streaks. I blinked against the brightness, my senses slowly sharpening. Ethan's side of the bed was empty, the sheets cool to the touch. For a moment, unease flickered through me, a reflex born from the tension of recent days. But then I heard the faint clatter of pans from the kitchen, and my breath eased. I wrapped myself in a robe and padded down the hallway, the smell of coffee leading me toward him. Ethan stood at the stove, his back to me, flipping something in a pan. His hair was slightly tousled, and he wore a plain gray t-shirt that clung to his shoulders in a way that made my heart ache with familiarity. You're up early, I said softly, leaning against the doorframe. He glanced over his shoulder, offering a small smile. Figured I'd make breakfast for a change. I raised an eyebrow. Is this a peace offering or an apology? Both, he admitted with a chuckle. Figured it couldn't hurt. I crossed the room, peeking into the pan. Pancakes. Don't get too excited, they might be burnt. I'll take my chances. He plated the pancakes and set them on the table along with 2 mugs of coffee. We sat across from each other, the morning quiet wrapping around us like a warm blanket. I was thinking, Ethan said after a few bites, about what you said yesterday, about not just surviving. I nodded, my stomach tightening slightly. Yeah, I want that too, he said. But I think we need to figure out what that looks like for us now. Things have changed, we've changed. His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. I know, I said quietly. And I think part of the problem is that I've been holding on to this idea of who we used to be instead of embracing who we are now. Ethan's gaze was steady. Who do you think we are now? I hesitated, searching for the right words. 2 people who have been through a lot but still want to be here, together. Even if we're not perfect. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That's a good place to start. Relief washed over me, loosening the tension in my chest. So what now? We keep talking, he said simply. And maybe we try to do more things like yesterday, spontaneous, messy things that remind us why we like each other, not just why we love each other. I laughed softly. Like dancing in the rain. Maybe not that exactly, he said with a grin, but you get the idea. I can work with that. We finished breakfast in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken promises lingering between us. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. After we cleared the table, Ethan turned to me, his expression thoughtful. There's something else I've been thinking about. Oh, I've been offered a project at work, he said carefully. It's big, would require some travel, but it's something I've wanted to do for a long time. I swallowed the initial pang of fear. The idea of him being away after everything we'd just gone through made my heart race, but I knew I couldn't hold him back. That sounds amazing, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. You should do it. You sure? He asked, searching my face. Yeah, I said firmly. I want you to have that, we'll figure it out. His shoulders relaxed and I saw the gratitude in his eyes. Thank you. This was love too, I realized, letting go of fear and choosing to support each other even when it wasn't easy. We've got this, I said, more for myself than him. His hand found mine, squeezing gently. Yeah, we do. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long while I felt like we were both ready to walk it together. And that was enough. The afternoon was quiet, the kind of stillness that invited reflection. After breakfast, Ethan had gone to his office to catch up on emails, and I found myself alone in the living room, my thoughts circling back to everything we'd said and left unsaid. I curled up on the couch, a throw blanket draped over my legs, staring at the patterns of light dancing across the floor. The house smelled faintly of coffee and pancakes, a comforting reminder that things were shifting between us slowly, tentatively, but undeniably. Reaching for my phone, I hesitated before opening my messages. There was one thread I hadn't revisited since that night. Sarah's name stared back at me, the last text still sitting unread. Are you okay? I exhaled sharply, guilt twisting in my chest. Sarah had been my sounding board for years, the person I turned to when I needed to vent or make sense of my tangled emotions. But after that dinner, the one where I'd made the offhand remark that had set everything into motion, I hadn't known how to face her. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally typed, "Hey, sorry I went radio silent. Can we talk?" Her response came almost immediately. I was starting to think you fallen off the face of the earth. Come over, be there in 20. I grabbed my keys, telling Ethan I'd be back soon. He raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details, simply nodding as I headed out the door. The drive to Sarah's place was familiar, the route etched into muscle memory. Her apartment was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of vanilla candles and the sound of soft music playing in the background. He opened the door with a smile that quickly faded into concern. You look like you've been through it, she said, pulling me into a hug. Understatement, I muttered, sinking into the couch as she handed me a mug of tea. So, she prompted, settling beside me. What's going on? Last time I saw you, everything seemed tense. I let out a bitter laugh. That's one way to put it. She waited patiently, her eyes filled with the kind of understanding only a true friend could offer. I messed up, I admitted. That night at dinner, I said something stupid and it spiraled into this whole mess with Ethan. Sarah's brow furrowed. What did you say? I cringed, the memory still sharp. I told you I'd never date someone like him. Her eyes widened. Oh, yeah, not my finest moment, I said, grimacing. He heard me, Sarah. He walked out that night and things have been rocky ever since. She took a sip of her tea, processing my words. Why did you say it? I don't know, I admitted. I was frustrated, trying to make some stupid point about settling, but I didn't mean it, not the way it came out. Sarah's expression softened. We all say things we don't mean sometimes. What matters is what you do afterward. I've been trying, I said quietly. We talked yesterday, really talked for the first time in ages. It was hard, but I think we're starting to find our way back to each other. That's good, she said, her smile gentle. You two are good together, Maya, don't forget that. I know, I said, my voice thick with emotion. And I don't want to lose him. You won't, she assured me. Not if you keep fighting for each other. I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my chest. Sometimes you just needed someone to remind you of what you already knew deep down. As we sat there, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, I realized how much I'd missed this, being seen and understood by someone who knew me almost as well as I knew myself. When I finally left Sarah's place, the sky was a brilliant shade of orange, the sun dipping low on the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of change. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Ethan standing on the porch, his hands tucked into his pockets. He looked up as I got out of the car, his expression unreadable. "Hey," I said, approaching him. "Hey," he replied. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, I went to see Sarah," I explained. "Needed to clear my head." He nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm glad she's good for you." "Yeah, she is." We stood there for a moment, the fading light casting long shadows across the yard. "I was thinking," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Maybe we should go away for a weekend, just the two of us, no work, no distractions." Surprise flickered through me. "Really?" "Yeah," he said firmly. "We need it, don't you think?" A smile tugged at my lips. "I think that sounds perfect." He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "Let's make it happen." As we stood there, the weight of the past slowly giving way to something lighter, I felt hope bloom in my chest. We weren't fixed, not by a long shot, but we were moving forward, and that was enough. The weekend trip was Ethan's idea, but I clung to it like a lifeline. A chance to escape the routine that had boxed us in, to step away from the quiet resentment and unspoken words that lingered in the corners of our home. We packed light, just a duffel bag each and a few essentials. The destination was a small cabin nestled by a lake, the kind of place where the only sounds were rustling leaves and the occasional call of birds. The drive was long but peaceful, punctuated by snippets of conversation that felt warmer than they had in weeks. When we arrived, the air smelled of pine and damp earth. The cabin was simple but cozy, with wide windows overlooking the shimmering lake. I stood on the porch, taking it all in while Ethan carried the bags inside. "Not bad, right?" he said, rejoining me. "It's beautiful," I admitted. "Good pick," he grinned. "Told you I had taste." I rolled my eyes but smiled, the playful banter easing some of the tension still coiled in my chest. The first evening was quiet. We made dinner together, pasta and a simple salad, then sat by the fireplace, the warmth chasing away the chill of the autumn air. I watched the flames dance, my thoughts drifting. "This is nice," I said softly. "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "We needed this." I glanced at him, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "I'm sorry," I blurted out, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. He looked at me, surprised but attentive. "For what?" "For that night," I said, my voice wavering. "For what I said, it was thoughtless and hurtful, and I've hated myself for it ever since." Ethan's expression softened, but he didn't interrupt. "I was scared," I admitted. Scared that we'd lost something important, that we were just going through the motions. And instead of talking to you about it, I lashed out. I wanted to seem strong, like I had it all figured out, but I didn't. "You don't have to have it all figured out," he said gently. "Neither of us does," I swallowed hard. "But I hurt you." "Yeah," he said honestly. "But I'm not blameless either. I've been distant, caught up in my own head, thinking everything was fine as long as we weren't arguing. I should have noticed sooner that you were struggling too." We sat there, the crackling fire filling the silence between us. "I'm here," I said quietly. "I want to be here with you, and I want us to be better, not perfect, but better." He reached for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We will be one step at a time." The weight I'd been carrying for so long began to lift, replaced by something fragile but hopeful. The next morning, we took a walk around the lake, the air crisp and invigorating. Leaves crunched underfoot and the water glinted in the early sunlight. Ethan's hand brushed against mine and I intertwined our fingers without hesitation. "This is good," he said after a while, getting away, clearing our heads. "Yeah," I agreed. "It feels like we can breathe out here." He glanced at me, a smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe we should make this a regular thing. Spontaneous weekends away," I teased. "Why not?" he said with a shrug. "Life's too short to get stuck in the same routine." I laughed softly. "Look at you, Mr. Spontaneous." "Don't get used to it," he warned playfully. We walked in comfortable silence, the path winding through tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze. I felt lighter, as though shedding the layers of doubt and guilt that had weighed me down for so long. As we neared the cabin, Ethan paused, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that work project," he said. "The one with the travel?" "Yeah," he confirmed. "I want to take it, but only if we're okay with it." I squeezed his hand. "We'll be okay. I want you to have this, Ethan. We'll figure it out together." His eyes softened. "Thank you." We stood there, the lake shimmering behind us, the wind rustling through the trees. "I'm proud of us," I said quietly. "Me too," he said, his voice steady. "We've come a long way. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, and it didn't need to be. What mattered was that we were still here, still choosing each other despite the flaws and messiness of life, and that was enough." The drive back home was quieter than the one to the cabin, but it wasn't the heavy kind of silence that lingered when things were left unresolved. It was the peaceful kind, where words didn't feel necessary because something deeper had already been said. Ethan's hand rested on the gear shift, his fingers occasionally brushing against mine. I found comfort in the simple gesture, a quiet reminder of the connection we'd fought to rebuild. As we pulled into the driveway, the familiarity of home settled around us. The trees lining the street had turned a brilliant orange and red while we were gone, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of change. Ethan killed the engine and glanced over at me. "Back to reality," he said with a small smile. "Yeah," I agreed, though this time reality didn't feel so daunting. We carried our bags inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around us. I set mine down by the stairs, pausing to take in the space that had once felt suffocating. Now it felt different, lighter somehow. Ethan stood in the living room, his gaze thoughtful. "You know," he said, "I was dreading coming back, thought maybe the cabin was just a bubble and everything would feel heavy again once we got home. But it doesn't, does it?" I said, reading his thoughts. He shook his head. "No, it doesn't." I walked over to him, my heart steady. "That's because we're different now." "Least trying to be." He nodded, his expression serious. "And I think we'll keep getting better." "Me too," I said softly. The doorbell rang, breaking the moment. I frowned, glancing toward the front door. "Were you expecting anyone?" "No," Ethan said, already moving to answer it. When he opened the door, Sarah stood on the porch, her arms crossed and a knowing smile on her face. "Well, look who decided to come back from their romantic wilderness adventure," she teased. Ethan chuckled. "Hey, Sarah. Come on in." She stepped inside, her eyes flicking between us. "You two look happy," she observed, a hint of surprise in her tone. "We're getting there," I said, exchanging a glance with Ethan. Sarah's smile softened. "Good, I was starting to worry about you, Maya." "I know," I admitted. "Thanks for sticking with me." "Always," she said firmly. Ethan excused himself to unpack, leaving Sarah and me in the living room. "So," she said, plopping onto the couch, "tell me everything. Was there dancing in the rain, tearful confessions by the fire?" I laughed. "Something like that, but mostly just talking, being honest with each other." "Sounds perfect," she said. "Messy but perfect." "That's pretty much us in a nutshell," I agreed. As we sat there, the weight of the past few weeks finally felt like it had been lifted. The cracks in my relationship with Ethan hadn't magically disappeared, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Later, after Sarah left and the house settled into evening quiet, Ethan and I found ourselves on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm light across the room. "You ever think about how close we came to losing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he admitted, "but we didn't." "No, we didn't," I echoed, and that was the truth that mattered most. We were still here, still choosing each other despite the hurt and misunderstandings. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As I leaned into him, his arm wrapping securely around my shoulders, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. The road ahead would have its twists and turns, but we were walking it together. And that was enough. "Thank you for walking through my story with me. Love isn't perfect, it's messy, raw, and sometimes it breaks before it bends. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that healing starts when we're brave enough to face ourselves and love harder anyway." Here, to every woman who's ever questioned, fought, or stumbled through love, you are stronger than you know. Keep choosing yourself and the love worth fighting for.